even Texas. Did you know in the Texas state constitution there is a law? It is illegal for you to carry wire cutters in your back pocket. I kid you not. It's illegal. Why? Well, because at the time that the law was made, they had a huge problem with people stealing cattle. And what cowboys and other people would do is they would go to a fence that held in cows, and they would use wire cutters to cut open the fence. And then the cows would roam loose, and then they'd go, oh, look, there's these cows roaming loose. I guess they're mine now. So, it was actually written into law that it's illegal to carry wire cutters in your back pocket. Now, are you actually going to be arrested for it these days? No, probably not, but it is a law in Texas, so don't do it. Unless you have a concealed wire cutter license. There's also another law. I love this one. It is actually in the Constitution of Texas, or the Texas Constitution, that it is illegal to fornicate with chickens. I kid you not. It's a law. It's illegal. It says it in the Constitution. Can't do it. Now, here's what bugs me about this. It had to have been such a problem that the Congress of Texas decided to write a bill, debate the bill, and vote on the bill. Which makes me wonder how many people were running around boinking chickens for this to be a problem. I mean, really? Aren't there, like, taxes and criminals and, you know, other things? No, apparently chicken boinking was a massive problem. I don't know. Yeah, so there's some crazy laws out there. But the difference being, you know, no one's going to sit there and say that boinking chickens infringes on my rights. My freedom of expression or whatnot. No one's going to say that. No judge is going to agree with them. So that's not really in danger. If you know what I mean. So, yeah. Pretty much said all I could say to that. No, I want to talk to him. So, yep, this is pretty much what I'm going to be doing for the next hour and a half. Because I want to get to level 50 so bad. I'm at like level 40, aren't I? Maybe 41? Who knows? Hiya! It helps if you lock on there, Sora. So, I am out of grinding request questions. Okay. So what now? History? Where were we in history? I know we were still in primitive warfare. I think we'd gotten to... I think we were actually at Alexander the Great. We were going to talk about the Battle of Gaugamela and all that. I think that's how you say it. Oh, what's the name? Grammaticus or something. There's two massive battles, or really famous battles, of Alexander the Great. He has tons of famous battles, but two in particular, that when you think Alexander the Great, you think these two battles. And I told you I said I was gonna tell you about them. The problem with that is really hard to describe a battle with just words. You really need diagrams, pictures, visual aids of some sort to understand a battle. So, instead, I think I'm just going to find some video of it on YouTube and put the link in the description and let you go watch it. Because I could tell you how the battle went and you'd be like, I didn't understand that at all. Or I could refer you to a video that describes how the battle went, and then you could be like, oh, that's what happened. So, yeah. Alright. Come on. Let's get him. Ouchie. I keep forgetting I don't have a time limit anymore. I keep like, I gotta get her! These guys are getting easier and easier. I want you to know how to beat them. Alright, let me get Yuffie. So, Alexander the Great was fantastic leader, was a charismatic leader, rode in the front line with the troops, actually got wounded in combat, which is unusual. Many generals in history were always behind, on the sidelines, you know, not taking place in the battle. And it is rare that such a fantastic general was also, yay, leveled up again, was also on the front lines with his troops. I wouldn't say rare, I'd say unusual. Because it did happen a lot, but the majority of great generals and tacticians and all that were in the background, which makes sense. It makes sense. It's not a fact of cowardness. It doesn't mean that they were cowards. It means that how do you control a battle well from the front line? Like Alexander the Great, sure, he inspired his men and was great and loved by his men and really good, but pretty much he had to plan every single one of his battles out in advance. And if the battle kind of didn't go his way in the middle of the battle, there wasn't a whole lot he could do about it because he was in the middle of the battle. He couldn't see the whole thing. He couldn't tell what was going on. Whereas if you stay in the background, maybe up on a hill somewhere, you can see the whole battle and how it's going. I'm level 41 now. So, yeah, but he pretty much conquered everyone he ever came across, including nations that were considered way more powerful than he was, because his army and his tactics were just unbeatable. He eventually stopped, not because he was beaten, not because he ran out of equipment or money or anything like that. He stopped eventually because his troops said, screw it, we're done. He's like, oh, come on! They're like, nope, we've pretty much conquered half the world. We want to go home. And he's like, but just one more. And they're like, no. He's like, fine, we'll go home. Something about years and years of fighting. They just were tired of it. Like his army literally rebelled against him. Come on, I'm trying to... Not him! I want you! Thank you. His army like literally rebelled against him and said, no, we're done fighting. He's like, but we're so good! And they're like, yeah, well, we're tired. We want to go home. And if your whole army says that, there's not much you can do about it except, you know, go home. Even a king isn't much of a king without the power to enforce it. So, and unfortunately on their way home. But it was funny though, because even on their way home, he's like, okay, fine, let's go home on this route that goes past a whole bunch of people we're going to beat up. See, we're going home. We're just going home in a very roundabout way that requires us to fight several people. Oh, that Alexander. But on their way home, Alexander got some sort of illness and died at the young age of like 35, I think. I think it was like 35, yeah. The young age of 35. Actually, it could have been much earlier, younger than that, because 35 isn't considered that young back then, and he was considered very young when he died. Might have been in his 20s. I'd have to go look that up. But yeah, so he died only in his prime, before he could really even appreciate his efforts, conquests, whatever you want to say. Talk. Alright, choose opponent. There we go. Haha! Alright. Hang on a second. Alright. Sorry, where was I? Oh yeah, he died, and then his new empire was broken up eventually into 3 separate kingdoms. It was called the Hellenistic era. Basically, after Alexander died, he had a half-brother who really wasn't fit to rule. He may have had mental problems. and a pregnant wife who did give birth to a son, but you know, babies can't rule that well. They have enough trouble not pooping the diaper, running a kingdom. So it kind of was between three generals, or three of his main generals, and they basically, well, fought amongst each other. It was actually really funny because what would happen is the three generals would, one general would amass a good amount of power and make the other two generals team up against him, and then he'd lose the power, and then another general would gain power, and the other two generals would team up against him, and it was like, really? Wow. This isn't repetitive at all. So eventually, all three of them kind of just created their own, carved their own kingdoms out of what Alexander had conquered, and they were called the Hellenistic kingdoms, and they lasted around 300 years or so, give or take, pretty much until the Roman Empire conquered them. And they were very successful kingdoms, and it begs the question why something like that works. Okay, for example, you look at the people who conquer large tracts of land, and when they die, sometimes that land has some sort of cohesion and remains the empire, like the Hellenistic Empire. Sure, it split into three empires, but it was still the lands conquered by Alexander, and you could tell that. And then you'll have people like the Mongol horde, like Genghis Khan, who conquered large area, and then and then as soon as he died, it split into, like, you know, 100 different nations. Not immediately, but he couldn't. The country could not last. It broke apart into many smaller countries, and the Mongolian Empire just disintegrated relatively overnight. So why sometimes does it have cohesion? You know, the lands that Alexander conquered, for the most part, remained conquered until Rome reconquered them. And why are some places like the Mongolian hordes conquests gone as soon as the leader's gone? I'm wondering if I should just ask you guys that and see if anyone knows the answer. There's obviously a lot of factors to it. Now I'll just go into it. There are a lot of factors. There's no one thing, but a lot of it has to do with who conquered and what they were conquering for and what they're good at, etc., etc. Like, for example, Alexander was a king. He was raised to be a king. He knew about diplomatic relations and what it took to run a kingdom, and not just how to fight, but how to run a kingdom. And his generals knew that as well, and they were really good at gaining power, holding power, and just basically running a kingdom in general. Whereas the Mongolian horde, for a perfect example, were fantastic at conquering lands, but they had no idea how to run a kingdom. They were nomadic people. They were always on the move. They didn't have a stationary kingdom. They didn't have a seat of power or a capital or any cities, for that matter. So they had no knowledge of how to run a city or a kingdom. Their entire existence had been conquer this area, move on to the next. And so they were extremely good at taking people over and conquering them and annihilating them. And then once they actually had the land, they didn't really know what to do with it. They didn't they didn't feel comfortable there. So they weren't ever good at holding on to what they captured, whereas Alexander's generals were much more adept at running an empire. There's also some other things involved. Another big issue is adaptation. The Genghis Khan and the Mongols weren't really interested in being like you. They took you over and they expected you to become like them, period. No ifs, ands, or buts. Scandinavians were the same, you know, Vikings. A lot of people were. They conquered you, and they had no interest in your culture, your ways of doing things, how you lived, how you viewed the world, none of that. They were Mongols, and you were conquered, and that was it. And because of that, they never really merged. They never learned their people's techniques or their culture. The other cultures generally resented theirs, and so when the guy who was holding it all together, you know, the glue, so to speak, died, everything fractured because there was no sense of cohesion. They all believed they were different people. and so they all fell apart. However, in the Hellenistic kingdoms and several other kingdoms, they adapted to each other. The Greek colonists who came over after Alexander conquered were more than happy to learn about the culture of the people who lived in Asia Minor, and vice versa.